Some objects don't wait to be discovered. They wait for the right heart to touch them. Every morning before sunrise, Claire Dawson walked 6 blocks through the old waterfront district, carrying fresh flowers she couldn't afford to keep. The city was already waking around her, delivery trucks rumbling over cracked pavement, coffee shops filling the air with roasted beans, and gulls circling above the harbor as if they owned the morning. Her tiny flower cart looked almost invisible beside polished storefronts and expensive boutiques, yet every bouquet she arranged felt like a promise that beauty still belonged to ordinary people. White lilies, pale roses, wild daisies gathered from local farms 30 miles outside the city. She treated each stem as though someone somewhere desperately needed it. Most mornings ended the same way. A few customers smiled politely before walking away. Some bought flowers for anniversaries she could only imagine. Others barely noticed the quiet young woman standing beneath the faded green awning while cold Atlantic rain threatened overhead. By noon, her fingers usually smelled of damp leaves and fresh petals instead of success. Rent was overdue again. The refrigerator in the small apartment she shared with her elderly aunt held little more than milk, bread, and half a carton of eggs. Still, every Friday she left one bouquet beside the weathered memorial near the harbor, even though she had never learned the name engraved beneath years of faded salt and wind. She simply believed forgotten places deserved flowers too. That morning the clouds rolled in faster than expected. A cold breeze swept through the narrow streets, sending loose petals spinning across the sidewalk. Customers disappeared almost instantly, ducking beneath umbrellas, while Claire carefully covered her remaining bouquets with a canvas sheet. She sighed quietly, counting the few bills in her apron pocket. Not enough, not even close. She pulled the cart toward the old market square, hoping the covered walkway might attract before the rain became impossible. At that exact moment, less than a mile away, several black SUVs slowed outside the city's historical museum. Men in tailored charcoal coats stepped out with unusual precision, surrounding a reinforced transport crate marked with faded symbols no ordinary visitor would recognize. The museum had announced a private exhibition of recently recovered colonial artifacts, but the object inside that crate had never appeared on any public inventory. Officially, it did not exist. Unfortunately for Claire, neither did the accident that followed. One sharp turn, one unexpected collision with a delivery van. The reinforced crate shifted just enough for something small to slide unnoticed through a damaged corner before the security team sealed everything again. Nobody saw the object disappear beneath the rainwater flowing toward the old market. Nobody except fate itself. Claire was kneeling beside her flower cart, rescuing scattered carnations from a puddle when her fingertips brushed against something cold hidden beneath soaked newspaper. At first she assumed it was an old metal paperweight. It fit easily into her palm, surprisingly heavy despite its size, carved from dark silver with delicate vines twisting around a single crystal that seemed almost asleep beneath layers of age. She frowned, gently wiping away dirt with the corner of her sleeve. Someone probably lost this, she whispered to herself. The crystal remained dull for one silent heartbeat. Then warmth spread beneath her fingers, not heat that burned, but something strangely alive, like sunlight trapped inside winter stone. Tiny veins of pale gold shimmered beneath the metal before fading almost instantly. Claire blinked. She looked around, expecting someone else to have noticed. The square remained nearly empty except for rain tapping softly against empty benches. She turned the object over again. There were no batteries, no buttons, no explanation. What she didn't know was that no human had touched that relic in more than 400 years without collapsing from its unbearable power. Yet it rested peacefully in her hand as though it had been waiting for her all along. Less than 3 miles away, inside the upper floor of an elegant black townhouse overlooking the harbor, a man who had not been surprised by anything in centuries stopped walking in the middle of a silent hallway. Luciano Deville slowly lifted his head. Every servant nearby froze without understanding why. For the first time in over 600 years, the ancient relic had awakened. And somehow, it had chosen a flower seller. Rain followed Claire Dawson all the way home, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the glowing shop windows above them. She pulled her flower cart through the narrow streets with one hand, while the strange silver relic rested inside the pocket of her worn denim jacket. She had intended to leave it with the police lost and found office before sunset, but the building had already closed for the day. Tomorrow, she promised herself, someone had to be looking for something that valuable. Every few minutes, her fingertips brushed against the outline hidden inside her pocket. Each time she did, The metal felt warm instead of cold, as though it recognized her touch. She tried to laugh at the thought. Objects did not recognize people, they were only objects, yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Across the harbor, Luciano Deville stood motionless inside a library lined with towering shelves of leather-bound books that had survived empires, wars, and generations long forgotten. Rain traced slow lines down the tall windows behind him while silence settled over the room. No one dared interrupt him. His closest advisor remained several feet away, waiting patiently until the king finally spoke. It awakened, Luciano said quietly. Marcus frowned. That is impossible. I know. The older vampire lowered his voice even further. The relic has been dormant since the Northern Accord. No living vampire has seen it respond. Luciano slowly turned toward the window overlooking the city skyline. His pale reflection barely appeared against the storm outside, yet I felt it. Marcus hesitated before asking the question neither of them wanted answered. Could another bloodline have survived? Luciano remained silent for several seconds. If it had been blood, that answer unsettled Marcus far more than any certainty could have. The relic had always answered to ancient laws that even vampire kings respected. If those laws had changed, centuries of certainty had changed with them. Meanwhile, Claire reached the aging apartment building where she and her aunt rented the second floor. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and fresh laundry. Inside, Aunt Margaret looked up from a crossword puzzle with a relieved smile. You are soaked. Claire laughed softly while setting down the empty flower buckets beside the kitchen sink. The flowers survived better than I did. She carefully placed the mysterious relic on the small dining table beneath the warm yellow light. Her aunt glanced toward it. Did someone buy you jewelry? Claire shook her head. I found it near the market after an accident. I am taking it to the police tomorrow. Margaret picked up the object carefully. The instant her fingers touched the silver surface, the warmth vanished completely. It is beautiful, she said, handing it back without noticing anything unusual. Claire accepted it again. The crystal immediately shimmered with a faint golden pulse before fading. She froze. Her aunt had not reacted at all. Did you see that? Margaret looked confused. See what? Claire forced a smile. Nothing, probably just the light. She slipped the relic back into her pocket before saying anything else. During dinner, she tried focusing on ordinary conversation. Grocery prices, the leaking faucet, whether next week's farmer's market would bring more customers. Still, her attention kept drifting toward the impossible object resting beside her. Less than an hour later, several unmarked black vehicles quietly entered the waterfront district without flashing lights or attracting attention. The passengers wore ordinary business suits instead of ceremonial black coats. To everyone passing by, they looked like executives arriving late for a meeting. Only their perfect coordination hinted that they belonged to something far older than any corporation. Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk and looked toward the rows of apartment buildings stretching across the neighborhood. A small device no larger than a wristwatch rested in his palm. Instead of displaying numbers, its crystal slowly rotated toward a single direction before glowing with pale amber light. She is close, he murmured. One of the others asked. Should we retrieve the relic immediately? Marcus watched the apartment windows glowing softly above the quiet street. No. His expression grew thoughtful. His Majesty gave only one instruction. Observe. Upstairs, unaware that strangers now surrounded her neighborhood, Claire opened the window beside her bed to let the rain-cooled air drift inside. The city sounded peaceful again. Car tires hissed across wet pavement. A distant ferry horn echoed through the harbor. Somewhere below, someone laughed before disappearing into the night. She removed the relic from her pocket one final time and placed it carefully on the windowsill beside a small vase holding the last white lily she had not sold that day. The crystal remained still for several quiet seconds. Then, without warning, it released a soft golden glow that illuminated both the flower and Claire's face. At that exact moment, 3 blocks away, Luciano Deville stepped out of a waiting car for the first time in decades without announcing his arrival. His silver eyes fixed on the distant light glowing through a second-floor window, and although Claire could not possibly know it, the man now walking toward her apartment was not searching for a relic anymore. He was searching for the woman who had awakened it. Claire Dawson stared at the soft golden glow until it slowly faded back into silence. The little silver relic looked ordinary again, resting beside the single white lily as though nothing unusual had happened. She reached toward it carefully, half expecting another pulse of light, but the crystal remained still beneath her fingertips. Outside, rain continued falling in gentle waves against the old brick buildings. Somewhere across the street, a taxi splashed through standing water before disappearing into the darkness. Everything looked normal again, and somehow that unsettled her even more. She closed the window, drew the curtains, and carried the relic to the small bookshelf beside her bed. Tomorrow morning, she reminded herself once again. The police station would open at 8 o'clock. She would hand the object over, apologize for keeping it overnight, and life would return to normal. Unfortunately for Claire, normal had already slipped beyond her reach. Luciano Deville walked quietly along the nearly empty sidewalk, with both hands inside the pockets of his dark overcoat. City moved around him without noticing his presence. Couples hurried beneath umbrellas. College students laughed outside a late-night diner. Delivery drivers unloaded crates beneath bright storefront lights. No one recognized the man who had ruled an invisible kingdom beneath the same skyline for centuries. His attention never left the second-floor apartment where the faint golden light had disappeared moments earlier. Marcus Bellagio approached from behind without making a sound. "The perimeter is secure," he said quietly. Luciano did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained fixed on the window. "Does she know?" Marcus asked. "No, should we bring her to the court?" Luciano slowly shook his head. "Not tonight." Marcus looked surprised. "My king, if another house discovers her first, they will not." There was no anger in Luciano's voice, only certainty. "No one approaches her unless I say so." Marcus lowered his head respectfully, but concern remained in his expression. Every powerful family within vampire society would eventually sense the relic's awakening. It was only a matter of time. Upstairs, Claire tried reading a novel before bed, but after turning the same page 3 times, she realized she had not absorbed a single sentence. Her thoughts kept returning to the impossible warmth inside the relic. She finally switched off the bedside lamp and closed her eyes. Sleep arrived slowly. Sometime after midnight, a loud clap of thunder rolled across the harbor. Claire woke instinctively and glanced toward the bookshelf. The room remained dark except for moonlight slipping through a narrow opening in the curtains. Then she noticed something strange. The white lily beside the relic had fully opened its petals. She frowned. When she had placed it there earlier, the flower had still been tightly closed after spending hours in cold rain. Now every petal looked fresh and perfectly alive, almost glowing beneath the pale moonlight. She quietly stepped closer. The water inside the vase shimmered with tiny golden reflections before returning to normal. "That is impossible," she whispered. She gently touched one of the petals. It felt warmer than the surrounding air. Before she could examine it further, a soft knock echoed through the apartment door downstairs. Claire looked toward the hallway clock. 12:43 in the morning. No one visited at that hour. Aunt Margaret had already fallen asleep. The second knock came, calm and patient rather than demanding. Claire slipped into a sweater and quietly walked downstairs, careful not to wake her aunt. She hesitated before looking through the small peephole. A tall man stood beneath the dim hallway light, wearing a black overcoat still covered with tiny drops of rain. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable. He looked more like an executive returning from an evening meeting than someone standing outside a stranger's apartment after midnight. Claire opened the door only a few inches. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. Luciano met her eyes for the first time. For one silent moment, neither of them spoke. Claire noticed how unusually pale he was, though not unhealthy, simply untouched by the weather around him. His silver-grey eyes reflected the hallway light with an intensity she had never seen before. There was nothing threatening about him, yet something about his presence made the entire hallway feel quieter. Luciano glanced briefly toward the second floor where the relic rested beyond the ceiling above them. Then his attention returned to Claire. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I believe you may have found something that does not belong to you." Claire instinctively touched the pocket of her sweater even though the relic remained upstairs. "Are you talking about the silver ornament from the market?" she asked. Luciano gave the smallest nod. "Yes." Claire studied him carefully. "How did you know I found it?" For the first time in centuries, Luciano did not have an immediate answer that he could safely give, and before either of them realized it, someone hidden across the street quietly raised a camera, capturing the first meeting between the Vampire King and the only human the ancient relic had ever willingly chosen. Claire Dawson kept one hand on the edge of the apartment door while studying the stranger standing beneath the dim hallway light. He looked perfectly composed despite the steady rain outside. His charcoal overcoat carried tiny drops of water that somehow never seemed to soak into the fabric. There was no briefcase, no umbrella, no sign that he had rushed across the city in the middle of the night. He simply stood there with remarkable patience, as though he already knew she would eventually answer the door. "If this is about the object from the market," Claire said carefully, "I was planning to turn it in first thing tomorrow morning." Luciano Deville offered a small nod that revealed neither relief nor disappointment. "I believe you," he replied. "May I ask you one question before you do?" Claire hesitated. Every lesson about speaking with strangers echoed through her mind, yet nothing about the man before her matched the feeling of danger she expected. Instead, there was an unusual calm surrounding him, almost like stepping into a quiet library after leaving a crowded street. "One question," she agreed. Luciano's silver eyes remained steady. "When you touched it, did anything unusual happen?" Claire instinctively thought about the warmth beneath her fingertips, the brief golden light and the white lily blooming hours earlier. She almost answered honestly before stopping herself. She barely knew this man. "Not really," she said with an uncertain smile. "It just looked old." Luciano noticed the hesitation immediately. He had spent centuries watching diplomats, rulers and rivals hide the truth behind carefully chosen words. Claire was not lying out of manipulation. She was protecting herself because she did not yet understand what was happening. Oddly enough, he respected that. Before he could respond, Aunt Margaret drifted softly from upstairs. "Claire, is everything all right?" Claire glanced toward the staircase. "Yes, someone is asking about the item I found." Margaret slowly appeared at the top of the stairs wearing a light blue robe, her reading glasses still resting on her nose. She looked toward Luciano with polite curiosity. "Good evening." "Good evening, ma'am," Luciano answered respectfully. Margaret smiled. "You must be from the museum." "The museum," Margaret shrugged. "Who else would come looking for an old artifact?" Luciano allowed himself the faintest smile. "That is a reasonable assumption." It was not an answer, but it was not exactly a lie either. Margaret descended a few steps before stopping. "If it belongs there, perhaps you should take it back tomorrow together. Claire has work early in the morning." Claire looked from her aunt to the stranger, uncertain how to respond. Luciano spoke before the silence became uncomfortable. Tomorrow would be acceptable. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a simple white business card. There was no company logo, no address, only a name and a phone number, printed in elegant black lettering. Luciano Deville. "If anything unusual happens before morning," he said, offering the card, "please call me immediately." Claire accepted it, surprised by its plain appearance. "You work for the museum?" she asked. "You could say I have a personal interest in protecting certain historical objects." It sounded like an ordinary explanation, yet something about the way he spoke made every word feel carefully measured. At that exact moment, across the narrow street, the hidden photographer lowered his camera and quietly transmitted several images through an encrypted device. Within seconds, those photographs began reaching private collections of influential vampire houses throughout the city. The images themselves revealed almost nothing: a human woman, a pale man in a dark coat, an apartment doorway. But one detail captured every observer's attention. The silver-haired stranger standing before the young flower seller had never been photographed in public with an ordinary human before. Inside one ancient estate overlooking the river, several silent figures studied the images without speaking. One elderly noble finally broke the silence. "If the king himself has gone to her," he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Back at the apartment, Claire glanced once more at the business card before slipping it into her sweater pocket. "Thank you for coming," she said politely. "I will bring the artifact to the police in the morning unless someone officially claims it." Luciano held her gaze for one quiet moment. "Miss Dawson," he said gently, "if possible, do not let anyone else touch it tonight." Claire frowned. "Why?" Luciano looked briefly toward the second-floor window where the relic rested unseen beyond the walls. "Because some objects do not become more dangerous when they awaken." His voice grew softer. "They become more valuable." Before Claire could ask another question, he stepped back into the rain with calm, unhurried movements. She watched until his figure disappeared beyond the corner of the building, never realizing he had no intention of going far. Less than a minute later, hidden in the shadows across the street, Luciano looked once toward Claire's glowing apartment window as Marcus quietly approached beside him. "My king," Marcus said in a low voice, "they have already seen the photographs." Luciano did not look away from the window. "Then tonight," he answered calmly, "our greatest challenge is no longer protecting the relic. It is protecting the woman who does not yet know why the entire hidden world has suddenly begun watching her." Claire Dawson barely slept after the stranger disappeared into the rain. Long after Aunt Margaret returned upstairs, she remained beside the living room window, absent-mindedly turning the plain white business card between her fingers. Luciano Deville. No company name. Just a phone number and a name that somehow sounded older than the city itself. Shortly before dawn, she finally climbed the stairs and found the silver relic exactly where she had left it beside the white lily. The flower looked even fresher than it had the night before, its petals perfectly open despite receiving no sunlight. Claire gently lifted the vase to replace the water, but the moment the relic touched the wooden shelf again, another faint pulse of golden light spread through the crystal before disappearing. This time she was certain she had not imagined it. She wrapped the object carefully inside a clean linen cloth before placing it inside her shoulder bag. No matter how unusual it seemed, someone had lost it and she intended to do the right thing. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean beneath pale morning light. Street vendors arranged fruit beneath colorful awnings while commuters hurried towards subway entrances carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Claire pushed her flower cart toward the market with the relic safely tucked inside her bag. Planning to stop by the police station after selling a few bouquets, she noticed something unusual almost immediately. Several strangers seemed to linger wherever she stopped, a businessman reading the same newspaper for 20 minutes. A woman feeding pigeons without ever looking at the birds. Two men sitting in a parked sedan across the street, speaking very little while occasionally glancing toward the flower stand. None of them behaved suspiciously enough to alarm anyone else. Yet together they formed a pattern Claire could not ignore. Less than a block away, Marcus Bellagio quietly observed the same scene from a sidewalk cafe. He wore an ordinary navy business suit, blending effortlessly into the morning crowd. A young vampire seated across from him lowered his newspaper. "House Viridian arrived before sunrise," he murmured. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly. "I counted them. And House Ashcroft? Watching from the rooftops." The younger vampire frowned. Marcus calmly stirred his untouched coffee. His Majesty was very clear. No confrontations, no unnecessary attention. He glanced toward Claire as she handed a bouquet of yellow tulips to an elderly customer, with the same warm smile she offered everyone. She must continue believing today is an ordinary day. Across town, Luciano Deville stood inside a quiet archive room hidden beneath an elegant historical society building. Shelves filled with centuries of handwritten journals surrounded him, while morning sunlight filtered through stained glass windows overhead. An elderly librarian placed a weathered leather volume on the table before him. "These are the earliest surviving records concerning the relic," she said softly. Luciano opened the fragile pages with extraordinary care. Most of the writing had faded beyond recognition, but one passage remained surprisingly clear. He read it twice before closing the book again. His expression changed almost too subtly to notice. For centuries, every royal record had claimed the relic answered only to an ancient bloodline, yet the oldest surviving account suggested something very different. It spoke of a keeper chosen not by ancestry but by character, compassion, mercy. An unshaken willingness to protect beauty even when no reward existed. Luciano looked toward the stained glass window as memories long buried quietly resurfaced. 400 years earlier, those lines had disappeared from every official copy. Someone had erased them deliberately. Meanwhile, Claire finished arranging fresh roses when a little girl stopped beside the flower cart, holding only a few dollar bills tightly in her small hand. "Are these enough for one flower?" she asked shyly. Claire smiled and selected the largest pink rose she had. "They are enough for two." The little girl's face lit up. "Really?" Claire nodded. "One for whoever you love." She added a white daisy beside the rose before accepting the child's carefully counted money. The girl skipped away, smiling, completely unaware that nearly every silent observer nearby had witnessed the exchange. Marcus watched without speaking. The businessman across the street watched as well. Even the figures hidden on distant rooftops remained perfectly still. At that exact moment, the relic inside Claire's shoulder bag released another faint pulse of golden light, softer than before but unmistakable to every vampire watching her. None of them looked surprised by the light itself. What unsettled them was when it appeared, not during danger, not during fear, not while she held it in her hand. It awakened quietly as Claire chose kindness over profit. Across the city, Luciano slowly closed the ancient journal and whispered only 4 words to himself. They remembered it incorrectly. Then he reached for his coat, because for the first time since the relic had awakened, he believed Claire Dawson was not carrying an object that needed protection. She was unknowingly revealing a truth that powerful families had spent centuries trying to forget. By late afternoon, the flower market had settled into its familiar rhythm, yet nothing about the day felt familiar anymore. Claire Dawson noticed the same dark sedan parked across the street for the third time since sunrise. Different drivers occupied the front seats each time, but the car never truly left. The businessman with the folded newspaper had vanished, only to be replaced by another well-dressed stranger browsing a bookstore window without ever stepping inside. Even the woman feeding pigeons returned with a different coat, but the same careful attention directed toward Claire's flower stand. She tried convincing herself that the city was simply busy, that she had become overly cautious after the strange events of the previous night. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. Just before 5 o'clock, she packed the last unsold bouquets into her cart and headed toward the downtown police station. The wrapped relic rested inside her shoulder bag, heavier than she remembered, though perhaps that was only her imagination. The station stood inside a renovated brick building with wide glass doors reflecting the fading afternoon sun. Claire climbed the front steps, reached for the entrance. Relic had become warm again, not painfully hot, simply alive. She instinctively stepped backward. The warmth faded almost immediately. Confused, she tried again, one step toward the doors. The crystal beneath the cloth grew warm. One step away, it cooled again. Claire frowned. She repeated the movement once more with exactly the same result. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered. A police officer exiting the building smiled politely as he passed. "Everything all right, miss?" Claire forced a nervous smile. "Yes, I just forgot something." She stepped aside, allowing several visitors to enter before quietly walking back down the stairs. She could not explain why she had left. She only knew something inside her refused to carry the relic through those doors. Less than half a block away, Marcus Bellagio watched the exchange from a shaded bench beneath an oak tree. He touched a small communication device hidden beneath his jacket. She turned away, he said quietly. Luciano's voice answered through the earpiece. "Describe everything." She intended to enter. The relic responded before she crossed the threshold. She chose to leave without understanding why. Silence followed for several moments. Finally, Luciano spoke again. "It has begun remembering." Marcus lowered the device slowly. Those words unsettled him more than anything he had witnessed since the relic awakened. Claire wandered aimlessly through the historic district, unsure where she was even going. The evening air carried the scent of the harbor mixed with fresh bread drifting from neighborhood bakeries. Office workers filled outdoor cafes while musicians performed beside old brick buildings glowing beneath strings of golden lights. She finally reached the small waterfront memorial where she left flowers every Friday. The stone marker remained weathered and nameless, just as it always had. Claire removed a simple bouquet of white daisies from her cart and placed it gently against the old granite. "Someone should remember you," she said softly, repeating the same words she spoke every week. As she stepped back, the wrapped relic inside her bag released another gentle pulse. The engraved surface beneath the cloth shimmered unseen, and for a brief moment the faded stone inscription became perfectly clear. Claire blinked in surprise. The worn letters that had been almost impossible to read suddenly stood out beneath the evening light. She leaned closer. The memorial honored volunteers who had rescued families after the Great Harbor Fire more than a century earlier. She had passed this monument hundreds of times without ever reading those names. Now every letter appeared as though freshly carved. Before she could understand what had happened, a familiar voice spoke quietly behind her. "You bring flowers here every week." Claire turned to find Luciano Deville standing several feet away with his hands folded calmly before him. He wore the same dark overcoat despite the clear evening sky. "I did not hear you walk up," she admitted. He glanced toward the memorial. "Why this place?" Claire looked back at the names etched into the stone. "Because most people hurry past it." She smiled faintly. "I think forgotten people deserve fresh flowers too." Luciano followed her gaze without speaking. For a long moment the sounds of the busy waterfront faded beneath the quiet rhythm of waves reaching the docks. Claire finally looked at him again. "I tried returning the artifact today." Luciano raised one eyebrow slightly. "Tried. Something felt wrong the moment I reached the police station." She laughed softly, embarrassed by how strange it sounded. "I know that makes absolutely no sense." Luciano's expression remained thoughtful rather than skeptical. Sometimes our minds recognize patterns before our words can explain them. Claire searched his face. "You keep talking as though you already know what this object is." Luciano did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the small bouquet resting against the memorial. The evening breeze gently lifted one white daisy from the arrangement. Before it could fall into the harbor, Claire instinctively reached forward and caught it with both hands. At that exact instant, the relic hidden inside her bag released its brightest pulse yet, illuminating the fabric with soft golden light that neither of them could ignore. Luciano stared at the glow in complete silence because the relic had never responded to fear, curiosity, or possession. It had responded only when Claire chose once again to preserve something beautiful before it could be lost. The soft golden light faded as gently as it had appeared, leaving only the evening breeze drifting across the harbor and the white daisy resting safely in Claire Dawson's hands. Neither she nor Luciano Deville spoke for several long seconds. The sounds of passing ferries, distant laughter, and waves against wooden pilings slowly returned, making the impossible moment feel strangely ordinary. Claire looked down at her shoulder bag before carefully lifting the wrapped relic into her hands. "It keeps doing that," she admitted quietly. "Always when something feels important." Luciano studied the linen-wrapped object without reaching for it. For centuries he had believed the relic answered to blood alone. Every royal record, every preserved account, every lesson passed from one generation of vampire rulers to the next had repeated the same certainty. Yet everything he had witnessed during the past 2 days contradicted those teachings. Claire had no ancient family crest, no hidden royal ancestry, no forgotten lineage waiting to be revealed. She simply kept choosing kindness when no one expected it. "Would you tell me what it really is?" Claire asked. Luciano met her eyes. He realized that another carefully crafted half-truth would no longer protect her. "It is older than this city," he answered. "Older than the country itself. For centuries people believed it recognized only a specific bloodline." Claire frowned. "And now?" Luciano looked toward the harbor, where the last rays of sunlight shimmered across the water. "Now I believe they misunderstood it." Claire remained silent, waiting. "The oldest surviving records were altered hundreds of years ago," he continued. "The original account did not describe a bloodline, it described a person." Claire laughed softly in disbelief. "You cannot seriously mean me." "No," Luciano replied with complete honesty. "I mean someone exactly like you." The words settled between them more heavily than either expected. Claire looked away, uncomfortable with the idea. "I sell flowers because I need to pay rent," she said. "I leave bouquets at memorials because no one else does. That does not make me special." Luciano's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No, it makes you consistent." Claire looked back at him, confused. "There is a difference." He slowly nodded toward the daisy still resting in her hand. "You caught a single flower before it fell into the harbor." Claire shrugged. "Anyone would have." Luciano gently shook his head. "No. Most people would have watched it drift away because it would have changed nothing." The evening breeze carried the scent of salt water and fresh flowers between them. Claire found herself remembering the little girl who had bought 2 flowers instead of 1, the forgotten memorial she visited every Friday, the injured plants she often rescued from dumpsters behind the market, simply because she could not bear seeing them thrown away. None of those moments had ever felt extraordinary. They were simply choices. What she did not know was that centuries earlier the relic had been created to recognize exactly those choices. Not wealth, not power, not noble birth. Only compassion freely given when no reward was expected. Less than half a mile away, inside an elegant townhouse overlooking the harbor, several representatives from the oldest vampire houses gathered around a polished oak table. The photographs taken outside Claire's apartment lay scattered before them. One elderly noble finally broke the silence. "The king has spent 2 nights beside an ordinary human." Another replied, "Perhaps she carries the lost bloodline after all." A third slowly shook his head. "Our observers watched her throughout the day. The relic awakened each time she chose another person's happiness over her own." Silence filled the room. No one wanted to say the conclusion aloud because it challenged everything they had believed for generations. Back at the waterfront, Claire carefully wrapped the relic once again. "If you are right," she asked quietly, "why would anyone erase the truth?" Luciano looked toward the darkening skyline. "Because blood can be inherited." His voice grew lower. "Character cannot." Claire absorbed the answer without speaking. Somehow it explained far more than she realized. It explained why someone powerful might prefer a world where only certain families could claim authority, instead of one where compassion mattered more than ancestry. Luciano turned toward her once more. "Miss Dawson, I would like to show you something tomorrow." Claire hesitated. Every sensible instinct told her to refuse, yet every conversation with this mysterious man had answered one question while raising another that felt even more important. "Where?" she finally asked. Luciano's silver eyes reflected the last light of sunset, the place where the relic was first entrusted to humanity. Before Claire could respond, the wrapped crystal inside her bag released another quiet pulse, brighter than any before, and for the first time a faint ancient symbol appeared across the linen itself before vanishing into the gathering night, confirming that the relic had not chosen a forgotten bloodline after all. It had chosen a way of living that the world itself had nearly forgotten. Claire Dawson did not answer immediately. The harbour lights shimmered across the water like scattered stars, while the evening breeze carried the scent of salt, cedar, and the last flowers from her cart. She had spent less than 48 hours knowing Luciano Deville, yet every conversation with him left her feeling as though she had stepped into a history no textbook had ever mentioned. She looked at the wrapped relic resting safely inside her shoulder bag before meeting his eyes once more. "If I say yes," she asked carefully, "am I stepping into something I cannot walk away from?" Luciano considered the question with unusual honesty. "You are already standing inside it." There was no threat in his voice, only quiet certainty. Claire let out a slow breath before giving the smallest nod. "Tomorrow, then?" Luciano inclined his head respectfully. "Tomorrow." Neither reached for a handshake. Neither tried to force trust that had not yet been earned, somehow that made the agreement feel more genuine than any promise spoken aloud. As Claire pushed her flower cart home beneath the cooling evening sky, she noticed something unexpected. The uneasy feeling that had followed her since finding the relic had begun to change. She was still uncertain, still confused, but no longer completely afraid. Less than a mile away, Luciano entered a restored greenhouse hidden behind an old stone estate that no public map identified. Tall glass walls reflected the moonlight, while hundreds of rare white flowers bloomed beneath carefully controlled temperatures. Marcus Bellagio was already waiting beside a long wooden table covered with aging maps and handwritten records. "She accepted?" Marcus asked. Luciano nodded once. "Tomorrow she will see the sanctuary." Marcus looked relieved before his expression became serious again. Several houses requested permission to question her. Luciano calmly removed his gloves and laid them beside the maps. "Denied. They will not appreciate being refused. They do not need to appreciate it." Marcus studied the king's face for a moment. "You believe the oldest records now?" Luciano rested one hand against the edge of the table where a pressed white blossom had been preserved between two sheets of glass for centuries. "I believe the relic has never lied." His gaze settled on the delicate flower. Only historians did. The following morning arrived with bright autumn sunlight spilling across the waterfront. Claire opened her flower stand earlier than usual, arranging fresh lilies, roses, and sunflowers beneath the green awning while the city slowly awakened around her. She expected another day filled with silent observers, but something had changed. The unfamiliar faces remained present, yet they kept a greater distance than before. They no longer watched with suspicion, they watched with careful curiosity. One elderly woman approached the stand carrying a small paper envelope. "Excuse me," she said warmly, "would you help me choose flowers for my husband's birthday?" Claire smiled gently. Of course. They spent several minutes selecting blue irises and white roses, while the woman quietly shared stories about 50 years of marriage, road trips across America, and the husband who still insisted on making pancakes every Sunday morning. Claire wrapped the bouquet carefully and tied the ribbon by hand instead of using the machine beside the register. "He is going to love these," she said. The elderly woman laughed. "He always says flowers matter more when someone arranges them with care." As she walked away, the relic hidden inside Claire's shoulder bag released another soft pulse of golden warmth. This time Claire did not panic. She simply smiled to herself, almost expecting it. Across the street, two observers exchanged surprised glances. Exactly as it had every previous time, Claire had chosen kindness over convenience. There was no pattern based on danger or ceremony, only compassion. Shortly after noon, a sleek black sedan quietly stopped beside the market. Luciano stepped out wearing a simple charcoal suit without a tie, blending easily among downtown professionals leaving nearby office buildings. Claire noticed him immediately. Somehow he always seemed composed no matter where she saw him, as though the noise of the city slowed before reaching him. "You came," she said. "I said I would." He looked toward her nearly empty flower cart. "Are you finished for the day?" Claire glanced at the last few bouquets. Before she could answer, A young delivery driver rushed over holding a bicycle helmet beneath one arm. "Do you have anything left under $20? He asked. "My mum is getting out of the hospital this afternoon." Claire looked at the remaining flowers, selected the freshest bouquet, and quietly removed several additional white lilies from another arrangement before wrapping everything together. "Take these too," she said. "She deserves something beautiful to come home to." The young man smiled gratefully before hurrying away. Luciano watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. He no longer needed ancient manuscripts to explain the relic. He was witnessing its language unfold in real time through the ordinary choices of an ordinary woman. As Claire locked the wheels of her flower cart and turned toward him, the golden warmth inside her shoulder bag spread farther than ever before, and somewhere beneath the old greenhouse waiting beyond the city, a stone chamber sealed for more than 400 years quietly answered with a single deep vibration, as though it had finally recognized that the person it had been waiting for was already on her way. The black sedan carried Claire Dawson away from the familiar streets she had known her entire life and into neighborhoods she had only seen from a distance. Glass office towers slowly gave way to tree-lined avenues where historic estates stood behind wrought iron gates draped with climbing ivy. The afternoon sun filtered through rows of towering maple trees whose autumn leaves painted the road with shades of gold and crimson. Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat, her shoulder bag resting on her lap, one hand lightly touching the wrapped relic hidden inside. She had expected endless questions during the drive, yet Luciano Deville seemed completely comfortable allowing silence to exist. Somehow that made the journey feel less like an interrogation and more like an invitation. After nearly 30 minutes, the sedan turned onto a narrow private road bordered by stone walls almost completely covered with flowering vines. Ahead stood what appeared to be an abandoned botanical conservatory built of weathered stone and towering glass panels that reflected the bright afternoon sky. Nature had reclaimed much of the exterior, giving the structure an almost forgotten beauty instead of neglect. "This is the sanctuary?" Claire asked quietly. Luciano nodded. "At least that is what the oldest records call it." He stepped from the car and waited while Claire joined him beneath the enormous arched entrance. The greenhouse felt unexpectedly warm despite the cool autumn air outside. Sunlight streamed through hundreds of glass panes overhead, illuminating countless rare white flowers growing in carefully maintained gardens. Some varieties Claire recognized immediately. Others looked unlike anything she had ever seen in florists, botanical books, or public gardens. Their petals reflected tiny traces of silver beneath the sunlight, as though morning dew had become part of the blossoms themselves. "These are beautiful," she whispered almost instinctively. Luciano watched her kneel beside a cluster of delicate white blooms instead of looking toward the ancient architecture surrounding them. "Most visitors notice the building first," he said. Claire smiled gently while brushing one fingertip across a flower without picking it. "Flowers usually tell you more about a place than walls do." Luciano lowered his eyes briefly. That answer sounded strangely familiar. Long ago, someone else had spoken almost the same words inside this very sanctuary. He quietly led Claire deeper into the greenhouse until they reached a circular chamber where vines climbed across carved marble columns surrounding a simple stone pedestal. There were no crowns displayed there. No weapons, only an empty circular space exactly large enough for one small object. Claire looked down at the wrapped relic inside her hands before glancing toward Luciano. "This is where it belongs," he nodded. "It rested here for generations before it disappeared." Claire slowly approached the pedestal. As she came within several feet, the relic began radiating gentle warmth through the linen cloth. Tiny strands of golden light escaped between the folds before fading into the afternoon air. The flowers surrounding the chamber seemed to brighten almost imperceptibly. Claire stopped walking. "It is reacting again." "Yes," Luciano answered quietly. "But not because of the stone." Claire looked at him. Luciano rested one hand against one of the weathered columns where faded carvings had survived centuries of wind and rain, because this place was never built to protect the relic. Claire frowned. "I thought that was its purpose." Luciano slowly shook his head. He looked around the peaceful sanctuary where sunlight danced across leaves instead of polished marble floors. "The truth is much simpler." Claire waited silently. This sanctuary was built to remind those who carried the relic why it existed in the first place. She studied the flowers surrounding them, which was, Luciano smiled very faintly, to preserve kindness before power convinced the world it no longer mattered. Claire remained motionless as those words settled into the quiet room. They sounded less like history and more like something the modern world still desperately needed to remember. What she did not know was that Luciano was speaking from painful experience rather than ancient scholarship. 400 years earlier, he had personally approved the decision to rewrite the official records after believing compassion made leaders vulnerable. He had allowed bloodline to replace character because it appeared easier to govern a divided world through certainty than through virtue. Standing inside the sanctuary again, surrounded by flowers that had quietly survived generation after generation, he finally understood how deeply that choice had changed everything. Claire carefully unwrapped the relic for the first time since arriving. The silver surface reflected warm afternoon light while the crystal at its center glowed softly without overwhelming brilliance. She slowly placed it upon the waiting stone pedestal. Instead of dramatic flashes or thunder, the sanctuary answered with perfect stillness. Then one by one, every white flower throughout the vast greenhouse gently turned toward the relic, as though greeting an old friend returning home, and hidden beneath the floor, where no human eyes had looked for centuries, an ancient stone doorway unlocked itself with a quiet echo that neither Claire nor Luciano had expected to hear. The quiet echo beneath the sanctuary floor lingered for several long seconds before fading into silence. Claire Dawson instinctively stepped back from the stone pedestal, her eyes searching the circular chamber for the source of the sound. Nothing appeared to move. The ancient columns remained wrapped in flowering vines. Sunlight continued pouring through the towering glass ceiling, and the hundreds of white blossoms still faced the silver relic, as though welcoming an old guardian home. Yet the air itself felt different. Not heavier, more peaceful, as if the building had been holding its breath for centuries and had finally exhaled. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked softly. Luciano Deville nodded once. Yes. His voice carried no surprise, only quiet reflection. Together they turned toward the far side of the chamber, where a narrow stone staircase almost completely hidden beneath climbing ivy had slowly revealed itself as sections of the floor shifted with remarkable precision. No machinery groaned. No dramatic movement disturbed the sanctuary. The hidden passage simply appeared, as though it had always been waiting for someone worthy enough to notice it. Claire looked toward Luciano. Was that staircase always there? He studied the newly uncovered entrance for several moments before answering. Not for anyone who came here before today. They descended carefully, guided by soft amber lanterns that gradually illuminated one after another without anyone touching them. The staircase led into a circular underground room carved directly into ancient stone. Unlike the elegant greenhouse above, this chamber contained almost nothing. No treasure, no throne, no ceremonial decorations. At its center stood a simple wooden table preserved beneath a clear glass cover. Resting upon it was a single leather journal whose pages had yellowed with age. Claire approached slowly. Someone left a diary? Luciano gently lifted the protective cover before opening the fragile book with extraordinary care. The handwriting inside remained remarkably clear despite the passing centuries. He read the first page silently before offering the journal to Claire. "Read the opening sentence." Claire lowered her eyes to the faded ink. "If you are reading this because the relic awakened for you, then remember one thing before anyone tells you that you are chosen. You are not chosen because you are greater than others. You are chosen because you never believed you were." Claire looked up in stunned silence. Luciano quietly continued turning the pages until they reached another carefully preserved entry. "The keeper must never rule through fear. The relic does not recognize strength. It recognizes the courage to remain gentle after disappointment." Claire slowly sat beside the old table, overwhelmed not by power but by simplicity. "This sounds nothing like the stories people usually tell about ancient objects." Luciano gave a faint smile. "Because most people expect history to celebrate victories." He looked around the empty chamber. The people who built this place believed history should celebrate mercy. For several quiet minutes, Claire continued reading scattered passages. None spoke of magical abilities or secret bloodlines. Instead, they described ordinary acts of kindness performed during difficult times. A physician who treated strangers without payment. A teacher who stayed with abandoned children during a harsh winter. A gardener who secretly replanted orchards destroyed by storms so neighboring villages would have food the following year. Each story ended with the same simple symbol that had briefly appeared upon the linen wrapping the previous evening. Claire gently closed the journal. These people were never famous. Most never realized their actions had been recorded. He walked slowly toward the chamber wall where a faded mural stretched across the stone. Time had softened many of its colors, but one figure remained unmistakable. A traveler offered a single beside a ruined road while others walked past without stopping. There were no kings depicted, no armies, no monuments, only one quiet moment of compassion. Luciano looked at the mural for a long time before speaking again. Centuries ago, I believed kingdoms survived because powerful leaders controlled them. His voice remained calm, but Claire noticed a rare trace of regret beneath every word. I was wrong. She joined him before the ancient painting. What changed your mind? He looked toward the greenhouse ceiling far above them, where sunlight filtered faintly through layers of stone and glass. You did. Claire immediately shook her head. Luciano smiled extraordinary. Exactly. He turned back toward the mural. That is what the sanctuary has been trying to teach us all along. At that exact moment, the silver relic resting peacefully above them released one final warm pulse, and throughout the sanctuary every white flower opened completely beneath the afternoon light, while hidden inside the oldest page of the journal, words that had remained invisible for more than 400 years slowly appeared in golden ink, revealing that the final chapter of the sanctuary's forgotten history had only just begun to reveal itself. Claire Dawson stared at the golden words slowly emerging across the final page of the ancient journal. The faded parchment seemed to awaken beneath the warm light filtering through the sanctuary above, each sentence revealing itself with remarkable clarity as though centuries of silence had simply been waiting for someone willing to listen. She read carefully, "The relic is not a reward, it is a reminder. Whoever carries it must never believe kindness belongs only to the weak, for mercy has preserved more kingdoms than fear ever conquered." Claire looked up at Luciano de Ville, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. Someone wanted this message to survive even if everything else was forgotten. Luciano nodded slowly, and someone else wanted it hidden. He rested one hand lightly upon the edge of the old wooden table. For hundreds of years I believed the version that remained. Claire watched him carefully. The calm confidence she had always seen in him had not disappeared, but something gentler now rested beneath it. For the first time since they had met, he looked less like a distant figure carrying impossible responsibility and more like a man quietly accepting a painful truth about his own past. They climbed the stone staircase together until the bright afternoon sunlight welcomed them back into the greenhouse. The sanctuary felt transformed, not because its walls had changed, but because Claire now understood why it had existed. The flowers surrounding the circular chamber no longer seemed mysterious. They felt purposeful. Every blossom represented quiet acts of compassion remembered long after names and titles had disappeared. Claire walked toward the stone pedestal where the relic still rested peacefully. "What happens now?" she asked. Luciano stood beside her without reaching for the silver object. "That depends upon you." Claire looked surprised. "I thought this belonged to your people." Luciano smiled softly. "It belongs to its purpose." Before Claire could respond, Marcus Bellagio entered the greenhouse with measured footsteps. He paused respectfully several yards away. "My king." Luciano turned. Marcus rarely interrupted unless absolutely necessary. "The representatives are waiting." Claire noticed the unusual weight behind those simple words. Several of the oldest families have requested permission to enter the sanctuary. Claire instinctively glanced toward the relic. Because of this, because of what it revealed? Luciano answered honestly. They have spent centuries believing leadership was inherited through blood alone. Today they learned they were mistaken. Claire remained silent for a moment before quietly asking, "Will they accept it?" Luciano looked across the sea of white flowers surrounding them. "Some already have." Moments later, the heavy greenhouse doors opened quietly as a small group of distinguished visitors entered without ceremony. There were no jeweled robes, no elaborate greetings, no display of authority. Men and women dressed in elegant modern clothing simply walked forward until they reached the circular chamber, then stopped several feet from the pedestal. None attempted to approach the relic. None questioned Claire. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward first. She looked at the flowers, then at the journal Luciano now carried beneath one arm. Finally, her eyes settled on Claire. "For many years," she said gently, "our families honored ancestry while slowly forgetting character." Her voice carried neither pride nor shame, only honesty. "Today your ordinary choices reminded us what our ancestors originally wished us to protect." Claire felt almost embarrassed by the attention. I only tried to do what seemed right. The elderly woman smiled warmly. Exactly. One by one, the remaining visitors quietly nodded in agreement. There were no speeches, no formal declarations. Only a shared understanding that something precious had been recovered without ever truly being lost. Luciano looked around the sanctuary where generations of misunderstanding had quietly ended in a single afternoon. Then he turned toward Claire. "Would you place the journal beside the relic?" Claire accepted the fragile book with both hands and gently laid it upon the stone pedestal. The instant the leather cover touched the ancient silver, the relic released one final wave of warm golden light that spread gently through the greenhouse instead of upward into the sky. Every flower shimmered softly beneath the glow before returning to its natural color. Nothing extraordinary remained except peace itself. The visitors stood together in respectful silence while sunlight poured through the towering glass ceiling, illuminating the sanctuary exactly as it had centuries before. And in that quiet moment, Luciano understood what the relic had protected all along. It had never been guarding power. It had been patiently preserving a simple truth that every generation needed to rediscover for itself, that the strongest legacy any leader could leave behind was not fear, wealth, or authority, but the quiet example of choosing kindness even when no one was watching. The sanctuary remained quiet long after the golden light faded, as though every stone and every flower understood that nothing more needed to be proven. Claire Dawson stood beside the ancient pedestal with her fingertips resting lightly against its cool marble edge. For the first time since she had discovered the silver relic beneath rain-soaked newspapers at the market, she no longer felt responsible for solving a mystery. The mystery had solved itself. It had simply required someone willing to listen instead of control. One by one, the distinguished visitors quietly departed the greenhouse without ceremony. Several paused to admire the white flowers before leaving. Others offered Claire a respectful nod, not because she possessed extraordinary power, but because she had reminded them of something they had forgotten about themselves. Soon, only Claire, Luciano Deville, and Marcus Bellagio remained beneath the towering glass ceiling. Afternoon sunlight slowly softened into the warm colors of early evening, painting gentle reflections across the sanctuary floor. Marcus stepped forward with an expression Claire had never seen before. It was not the composed formality he carried so naturally. It was gratitude. "Miss Dawson," he said sincerely, "for centuries I believed loyalty meant protecting traditions exactly as they were handed to me." He glanced toward the relic resting peacefully beside the journal. "Today I learned loyalty also means correcting them when they drift too far from the truth." Claire smiled modestly. "I do not think I changed anything by myself," Marcus answered without hesitation. "No, you reminded us to change ourselves." He respectfully inclined his head before quietly leaving the sanctuary, allowing the remaining silence to belong only to Claire and Luciano. They wandered slowly through the greenhouse without speaking, surrounded by countless blossoms glowing softly beneath the fading daylight. Claire paused beside a long stone bench overlooking a garden filled with white lilies. "Can I ask you something?" Luciano nodded. "Anything." Claire folded her hands together thoughtfully. "When we first met outside my apartment, you already knew the relic had awakened. Yes, but you never tried to take it away from me." Luciano looked toward the lilies swaying gently in the evening breeze flowing through partially opened glass panels overhead. "For many years I believed leadership meant deciding what was best for everyone else." He smiled quietly. "Then I watched a flower seller give away flowers she could have sold because someone else needed them more." Claire lowered her eyes with a shy laugh. "That was not leadership." "No," Luciano agreed. "It was something much harder." She looked back at him. "What?" "Trusting kindness even when it costs you something." Claire considered those words while the peaceful silence settled comfortably between them. She realized she was no longer speaking to a mysterious stranger whose presence unsettled her. She was speaking to someone who had spent centuries carrying certainty and now possessed the courage to let it change. As they reached the greenhouse entrance, Luciano stopped beside the old wooden doors and looked back toward the sanctuary one final time. "The relic should remain here," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "I think it wants to." Luciano smiled. "I believe you are right." They stepped outside together into the cool evening air. The estate gardens stretched peacefully toward the horizon where the first stars appeared above the darkening sky. Claire breathed deeply, noticing how ordinary everything suddenly felt. Crickets sang beneath nearby hedges. A distant fountain whispered softly through the gardens. Somewhere beyond the trees, church bells announced the approaching hour. The world had not transformed because an ancient mystery had been solved. It simply continued beauty forward, one ordinary moment at a time. Luciano walked with Claire toward the waiting sedan, but stopped before either reached the car. "Miss Dawson." She turned. "You still have your flower stand tomorrow." Claire smiled. "Of course I do." "Good." His expression warmed in a way she had never seen before. "The city would notice if its flowers disappeared." Claire laughed softly. "Then I suppose I should be there before sunrise." Luciano nodded. "I believe that is exactly where you belong." She looked at him thoughtfully. "And where do you belong?" He glanced toward the greenhouse, where the relic now rested peacefully among flowers instead of hidden beneath layers of secrecy. After a long moment, he answered with complete honesty. "Perhaps I have been asking the wrong question for 600 years. Claire tilted her head curiously. Luciano smiled. "Perhaps the better question is not where I belong." He looked toward the city lights glowing in the distance. "It is how I choose to serve it from now on." Together they watched the first evening lights appear across the skyline, and although neither of them spoke another word, both understood that the greatest change had not happened inside the sanctuary. It had happened quietly inside the heart of a king who had finally discovered that compassion was never the opposite of strength. It had always been its highest form. Before sunrise, the waterfront looked exactly as it had 1 week earlier, wrapped in cool morning air while the first rays of light painted the harbor with soft shades of gold. Delivery trucks rolled across familiar streets, coffee shops unlocked their doors. Seagulls circled above quiet waves waiting for fishermen to begin another ordinary day. Claire Dawson pushed her flower cart into its usual place beneath the faded green awning and smiled as she arranged fresh lilies, white roses, and bright wildflowers exactly the way she always had. Nothing about her stand announced that she had uncovered a forgotten truth capable of changing an ancient society. To everyone passing by, she remained the same young woman, selling flowers with gentle hands and an easy smile. That was precisely how she wanted it. A few minutes later, an elderly customer stopped to buy daisies for his wife's birthday. Claire wrapped the bouquet with careful attention before refusing the extra $5 bill he accidentally left on the counter. "You already paid enough," she said kindly. The man thanked her warmly before continuing down the sidewalk. Across the street, several familiar faces quietly observed the exchange. The businessmen with folded newspapers no longer hid behind careful disguises. The elegant women who had once watched from a distance now simply passed by with respectful smiles. They were no longer studying Claire because they feared what she represented. They were learning from the quiet example she never realized she was setting. Not far away, Luciano Deville stood beside the harbor wearing an ordinary dark overcoat, unnoticed by the growing morning crowd. Marcus Bellagio approached with 2 paper cups of coffee from a nearby cafe. He handed one to Luciano before looking toward the flower stand across the street. "She has returned to exactly the same life," Marcus observed. Luciano accepted the coffee with a faint smile. "No." Marcus looked puzzled. Luciano nodded toward the people gathering around Claire's cart. She returned to the same place. He watched a young office worker leave carrying flowers for a sick neighbor after Claire quietly added an extra bloom at no additional charge. The lives around her are already changing. Marcus followed his gaze and slowly smiled in understanding. Power had not spread from the sanctuary through commands or ceremonies. It had spread through ordinary people choosing to repeat one small act of kindness after another. Later that morning, Claire noticed Luciano approaching without hurry, carrying nothing except a simple bouquet of white lilies. She laughed softly. "You bought flowers before visiting a flower seller?" He returned the smile. "These are not for buying." He placed the bouquet gently beside the weathered harbor memorial, where Claire had left flowers every Friday long before they met. Together they stood quietly before the old stone marker while morning sunlight warmed the granite. "You remembered," Claire said. "I remember what matters now," Luciano answered. For several peaceful moments neither spoke. They did not need to. The city awakened around them with the comforting sounds of ordinary life continuing exactly as it should. Children hurried towards school, carrying oversized backpacks. A bus driver waved to familiar passengers. A street musician began playing a gentle melody beneath the corner clock tower. Claire looked toward Luciano. "Will you visit the sanctuary often?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Only when I need to remind myself what leadership is for." Claire smiled. "Then maybe you should visit the flower market sometimes too." Luciano laughed quietly, the sound so natural that even he seemed surprised by it. "I believe I will." Together they walked back toward the flower stand where the first group of customers had already begun gathering. Claire returned to arranging bouquets while Luciano helped carry fresh buckets of water without drawing attention to himself. No one there knew the quiet man beside her ruled a hidden kingdom. They only saw someone willing to lend a hand before another busy day began. Across the harbor, the morning sun rose fully above the skyline, filling every window with warm golden light. Deep inside the forgotten sanctuary, the silver relic rested peacefully upon its stone pedestal, surrounded by blooming white flowers and the restored journal whose final pages would never need to hide their truth again. It no longer waited for another chosen bloodline. It no longer searched for another forgotten heir. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment the world remembered that compassion could never be inherited through birth alone. It could only be chosen, one ordinary decision at a time. And on the same quiet street where a lonely flower seller had once stood beneath cold rain, hoping someone might buy a single bouquet, Claire now greeted the morning beside a man who had finally laid down the invisible weight of 6 centuries as together they handed the first flowers of the day to laughing children on their way to school, proving that sometimes the greatest endings do not arrive with crowns, applause, or miracles. Sometimes they arrive with sunrise, open hands, and the simple decision to keep choosing kindness again tomorrow.